1 second while I take care of the socials. Right, I should do it. How's everyone doing? Hi, thank you for joining me. Today we are going to talk about Laravel policies, because I've seen several times questions about how to handle authentication, well, not authentication, but authorization to the resources that you are using in your Filament projects. And more often than not, the answer is you should use policies. You shouldn't worry about Filament doing it for you. You should instead let Laravel do it for you. And by transient properties, or by default, Filament will actually take your policies from Laravel and enforce them enforce them automatically, basically. And today we are going to see how that looks on a typical Filament project. So for this, I'm using the code from my Filament Bootcamp course. So this is the dashboard that you get to create if you follow that course. If you're interested, the link is in the description. But today is not about the implementation of this dashboard. It's about how adding policies to the models that are used in this panel, in this case, categories and transactions, how adding policies to those affects how the panel looks and works. So, like I mentioned, I only have 2 models in this project, and therefore 2 resources. One is for transactions, which takes care of adding, this is like a budget app where you keep track of your expenses, and those expenses belong to certain categories. So we have models and they have a relationship between them. The first policy that we are going to cover, actually, let me show you what the code looks. So first of all, how do you create policies? It's incredibly simple. In your project, whenever you have a model and you have to restrict, hey Hamad, sorry, I didn't look at the chat in this whole time. How you doing, man? Thank you for being here. Sorry for that. So in any Laravel project, when you have a model, you can restrict what actions can be taken on that model's record, and this is tied to the logged in user, basically. So you have a logged in user and you can decide what that user can do in your models. What actions can that user take on your model? So to create a policy, once you have a model, you just do PHP artisan make policy, and the naming convention, so that Laravel knows that this policy is associated with a certain model, is that you name it with the name of the model and then the word policy. In this case, I have a transaction model. Therefore, my policy is going to be called transaction policy. If you don't use this -- model flag, Laravel will create an empty policy class. But if you use -- model and then include the name of your model, which the name of the model for which you are creating this policy, then Laravel is going to scaffold all of the methods that you can use on that policy. Hey Milen, hi. Long time no see, so good to see you live for a dose of wisdom. Thank you for being here. I know. Um, I've seen all of your questions. I will take some time to answer them because of time constraints, but I see them and I will eventually get to them and reply to them. Thank you so much for being so eloquent and for being here as well. So yeah, I like to use the model flag because that will give me a lot of code and I don't have to remember, okay, which method do I need to use for this policy. It just gives you all of them. The only problem is that you have to go in and actually add some code to it, because if you leave them as is, it's going to not work. It's going to give you errors. So I've already gone ahead and created my two policies, one for the transaction model and another one for the category model. And they look like this. Let's start with categories. So category policy. Now, initially, this line looked like this. So Laravel scaffolds your methods, but it does not give you a return value. So if you want to use this policy, you have to go in and manually set the return value for each method. And in this case, you're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 methods in total. We're gonna cover each one and how those affect your Filament project. I'm not gonna cover any complicated logic as to basically the result of each of this method has to be true or false. That's it. So in this case, I'm just setting everything to true so that this model is basically open. But the decision of how the logic of the policy works depends on the specificity of your project. What is the condition that every user needs to meet in order for that user to have different actions available on that model? So in this example, since the end result has to be just true or false, I'm just going to use the true or false value. So in this case, let's start with category. If we go to our project here and we move to the category resource, watch what happens when I set view any to false. So view any basically means, can this logged in user, which is provided to you as a parameter to this method, so you can use that parameter, which basically represents the currently logged in user. So you have to think about what is the condition for this user to be able to view basically any record in my category, or in other words, just a list of the records in my category model. In this case, if I just set this value to false and then save, if I'm here and then refresh, Filament is going to say you don't have authorization to list the records in this resource, and therefore it will give you a 403 response. But if I go back to the transaction resource, if you're not in the resource that was denied to you at the moment, Filament basically just eliminates that link from the sidebar menu. As you can see, I don't have the category link available to me because I am not authorized to view the category records. If I set that back to true, you can see how the link comes back because now I have access to listing records. Now, you might be thinking, well, what happens if, in this case, for example, I have a food category and that food category has a relation manager, which lists all of the transactions that have been made under this category. So what happens if I am allowed to view the category, but not the list of transactions? Well, we can try that out really quick. This is a view, so it's an info list view. So this works on both info lists and also on the edit page, where you also have access to relation managers. But for now, let's take a look at what happens if we go to the transaction policy and I deny access to the user on the view any method. So the user is not allowed to list any transactions in this case. Set that to false. And what happens is, if you guessed it, you basically don't have a relation manager. So you have access to the parent method, but you cannot list any relation on that method. So you don't have a relation manager. The relation manager basically disappears. There is no error because you can still view the category, but you can't see the relation manager records. And also, as you can see, the link also disappears from the sidebar menu. Set that back to true. And yeah, that's basically view any. View any is the ability for the user to list any records in your models. If you set that to false, then you don't have access to the page in your Filament project. If you guess that page for in any way and you get to it via direct access in the link, you get a 403 unauthorized response. Now, let's talk about creating records. Let's go back to transactions here. And what if I am allowed to view all the transactions, but I'm not allowed to create any of them? So for that, you would go to, in this case, I'm gonna look at the transaction policy and head down to the create method. If you notice, some of these methods have access to the logged in user, and some of them also have access to the specific model record that you are dealing with. And we'll get to an example of those in just a second. But for now, the create method is just associated with the logged in user. So can the logged in user create any records in this model? If I set this to false and go back to my project, what happens is that Filament will detect that policy and eliminate any access for me to create records. In this case, the action that was up here in this corner to create new transactions disappears. So, and also, if I, again, let's take that back to true. If I was in the transaction, create transaction form, by the time I lose access to it, what I get is a 403 forbidden response. So as a general rule, if you are in the place where you're not supposed to be when you lose access, you always get a 403. And if you're not, basically Filament denies you the access to creating a record, editing a record, view a record. We'll see examples of that. So right now I can't create transactions. Now, this also applies to relation managers. If you are aware, hey Tuto, does the admin still consider as a user? In this case, it is not controlled by the policy. No, the policy only have access to the user. So if the user is an admin, it is on your it is your responsibility to take that logged in user and check for any conditions that will eliminate access to any of the actions on this model. So if, for example, the user model has a Boolean property, so the user has maybe an is admin column that is true or false, then it's on your behalf to make that check on that Boolean and whether return true or false. Policies only return true or false. Can you do or can't you do what you want to do? Is the user allowed or not? That's it. All the conditions that meet that criteria of true or false depends on your specific application, your specific needs, and you are the one who decides what do I need to check for me to give or deny access to the currently logged in user, so that I can return whether true or false. That also applies to roles, because if you have access to the logged in user and the logged in user has a relationship with roles, then this is where you check those roles. If the user is an admin or an what are other roles, regular user, editor, etc., this is where you check those roles and you make the decision based on those roles to whether return true or false, denying or granting access for the user to the resource. Now, as I was saying, if you are aware of relation managers, for example, let's go into food here, which is the only one who has transactions, and you go into the edit form. This edit form also has a relation manager, and on relation managers you also have access to create new records. But if you deny the access to create records in the policy, for example, setting the create method returning false from the create method in the transaction policy, Filament will also deny the ability for you to create new records from relation managers. That covers creating records. Now, there's another point that I wanted to cover. For example, if I go to transactions and let me allow access to create new records here. When I create a new transaction, I have a drop-down field that basically lists all of my categories here. Now, what do you think happens if I restrict access and I say that the user is not allowed to list categories? Am I going to have an empty drop-down, or is it not going to affect it? Well, let's go ahead and see. Let's move to the category policy, to the view any method, and set this to false. If I refresh and check the dropdown, I still have a list of categories because Filament does not apply policies to drop down lists that depend on related or that depend on a relationship. If we check the code for this real quick, let's go to the category resource, the transaction resource, and take a look at the form. You see that I am adding a select field that depends on the category relationship. So policies do not apply to dropdowns. If you deny access to the list method or listing records on the model for which you are using a dropdown, that dropdown can still see all of the records, because technically when you're creating a transaction, you still need to give it a category. When you're creating a new record that has a dependent dropdown field of a relationship, you still need to access those values, because if you can't, you would effectively be denying the ability to create transactions. In this case, I should have access. I actually have the ability to create transactions. But if the view any policy would affect here, would be taking effect here, and I couldn't see the categories, then I would be denying the access to create transactions, which is not intended. So dropdowns not affected by policies. Keep that in mind. Now, on the other hand, this category dropdown does have the ability for me to create new categories. But if you deny the access for creating categories in the category policy, so basically go down to create, set this to false, and then come back here. Did I save? Yes, I did. Let's say test. So dropdown basically dropdown fields are completely not affected by policies. This is something that you have to keep in mind, because if you're going to give access for the user to create categories on the dropdown, even if you deny them access on the policy, it is not going to take effect here, because again, it would be like denying the user the ability to create transactions, which is not intended. So keep that in mind when using dropdowns that allow the user to create records and list records. If you don't want them to do that, you would probably need to use a custom query for your dropdowns. If you need to do any additional checks, if you want to restrict which records the user have access to on a dropdown, you probably need to go into custom queries for your dropdown instead of just using a relationship like this. Okay. So we have covered listing records. We have covered creating records. Let's take a look at editing records. And let's start with giving back access to the user for categories real quick. I feel like it's not saving. Why can I see categories? Oh, it's because the view any is false as well. All right. So editing records. Let's start from the table. Right now I have these actions which allow me to edit records. If I deny the user to update records, in this case the method name is update, and I'm going to do it in the category. Setting this to false basically eliminates the link that allows me to go from the table into the edit form. And pop quiz, what happens if I am already in the edit form when that happens? What do I get? 403 response. So the tables react to policies by denying access to the action that I need to do, right? That's very simple. That's all it happens. This also applies to viewing records. For example, and quick distinction here again. You, in this case, have access to the specific records that you can restrict access to. For example, what happens if, let's say, for this example, that I cannot update just one record. I know that this record food has the ID of 1. So just as an example, I'm going to return category ID is different than 1. So what I'm saying here is, if the category ID is not 1, then you can edit that category. So all of the other categories I can edit except the category ID number 1. So if I save that, then I only lose the link to edit that category on the table. In this case, food. And you can make any combinations between the user and the category. You can check that the category belongs to the user based on any relationship that your application has. Maybe the category belongs to a user, so that category has a user ID or a relationship to that user. So you can compare the user ID to the category owner maybe, and based on that comparison, whether return true or false, whether giving access to the user on that specific category or denying it. Let's get this back to true so that I can get all the links. And as you can probably guess by now, this is also the case for viewing records. If we go to the view method here, which is very similar to the edit record, you have access to the user that is logged in and which category you are dealing with. If I just set this to false, then I lose the access to the info list form where I can see the category record. Same thing with delete. You have a delete method here with the logged in user and the current category that you're working with. If I set this to false, then I also lose the access to the link that allows me to delete that record. Now, when I'm dealing with delete, you also lose the access or lose the action in the actual edit form. If I set this back to true, you see that I have a delete button in that corner right there. If I set that to false and I deny access for the user to delete this record, then that button will disappear, but only for this record if that's what you want. Or you can deny delete access to all the records for the currently logged in user by just returning false on the delete method. Same thing with view. And let me see. Oh, I need this on true actually. Did it save? Yes. Okay. Let's make this view also true. Now this project doesn't have tenancy enabled, but the concepts are exactly the same. When you have tenancy, if the user has any limitations on your tenancy model, like viewing any, edit, delete, create, any of those limitations will also be applied to the tenancy UI. What would be the logic to restrict user from viewing a record, but to allow to edit it, which technically still allows you to view the record data? So when you deny access to the view, you're not denying access. Let me see if I get the question right first. Restrict the user from viewing the record. So view is this link, right? So viewing the record means that I can see the record data, but I cannot change it, right? But you want to not be able to see it, so the user cannot see the data, but they can edit it. So denying access to the view in this case false, does not restrict the edit. So you can still go into the edit, because edit and view in Laravel's eyes is different. Does that answer your question? So you can, technically you can see the user data here because you can see it, but the edit and view restrictions are completely separate. So you still have access to the edit, but you cannot access the view link, or you cannot see the info list form for that record. Okay, so yeah, and also there are a few other, the last two methods here, which are, these are for self-deleting records. On Filament, I think, if I'm not mistaken, when you have self-deleting, you can self-delete a record, but you can also restore that record from being self-deleted, or you can actually permanently delete that record. And these two methods will either grant or restrict access to those actions in Filament, depending on what you return here. So restore, whether the user can restore a self-deleted record, you have access to both parameters. Same thing with force delete. Can the user forcibly and permanently delete a record that was self-deleted previously? Again, those are not, this project does not have any examples of those, but based on the logic that you have seen so far, they applied exactly in the same way. I hope that that is clear to all. And this is a very short live stream. I just wanted to cover all of the interactions from policies in Filament, so that everything is crystal clear and you have a very clear idea of what policies do in Filament and how they are enforced in every Filament project. If you have any questions, if you have any specific examples that you want to discuss, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments. I'm taking some time to go through all of the comments this next few days, so I will get to your questions eventually, but do allow me some time. And also, if you want to hop in the Discord server, the link is also in the description, so that you can post your questions there as well. And if you found any of this helpful, don't forget to leave me a like. It's always helpful. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other live streams or videos. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.